So let's talk about a moment that didn't just reshape the world map, but actually changed the very DNA of American politics. We're going to look at the George H.W. Bush presidency and how his administration, almost by accident, gave us a perfect snapshot of a huge shift in how our leaders talk to us and to each other. And it all kind of starts with this, a simple, almost funny mistake. A Christmas card from the Vice President, Dan Quayle, and it's got this glaring typo, beacon instead of beacon. Now, this wasn't just a spelling mistake. You see, this little error became a huge symbol, a running joke that perfectly captures one side of the story we're telling. But to really get why that typo mattered, we first have to talk about the man in charge. Our story really kicks off in 1989, and the world is changing at this absolutely dizzying speed. The Cold War, this conflict that had defined everything for generations, wasn't just ending, it was completely falling apart. I mean, this was a huge deal. It wasn't just a political win, it was a moment of massive global instability and also incredible opportunity. And the person steering the ship for America was President George H.W. Bush, a man whose entire life looked like it had been training for this exact moment.
I mean, just take a look at this resume. Bush wasn't just some politician. He was a war hero, a top diplomat, the head of the CIA. He knew most of the world leaders personally. This was a serious guy for a very, very serious time. And it wasn't just about the resume, right? He had this big vision to go with it. Bush talked about building a new world order. And what he meant by that was a world built on practical, evidence-based cooperation. It was this grand, sober vision based on shared facts and mutual understanding. So you have the president trying to basically architect a whole new world. And then you have his vice president who was, well, building a totally different kind of reputation back home.
And check this out. This press release from 1992, it just perfectly captures how absurd things got. While President Bush is dealing with the fall of entire empires, the number of jokes about his VP on late-night TV had tripled. He was literally becoming a national punchline. But if there was one moment that just sealed the deal, it was this. At a spelling bee, of all places, Vice President Quayle confidently tells a 12-year-old kid to add an E to the end of potato. The kid was right, the vice president was, well, not. And that story just became an instant classic. So all of this just makes you wonder, right? Why? Why would a president with this serious, evidence-based view of the world, this man with all this experience, choose a running mate who was becoming a walking gaffe machine? You might think it was just a huge mistake, right? A total miscalculation. But the thing is, it wasn't. It was all part of the plan. See, Quayle was a purely strategic choice. He was young, which made the older Bush look more fatherly and experienced. And, maybe most importantly, he really appealed to the conservative and evangelical parts of the party, pulling in voters that Bush himself might not have energized. So the choice wasn't a mistake. It was a cold, hard political calculation. Okay, and this right here, this is where our little story about two politicians explodes into something much, much bigger. Because that whole dynamic, the serious statesman and the popular firebrand, it wasn't a one-off thing. It was actually a perfect picture of a deep, profound change that was happening to the language of politics itself. So some incredible research analyzed millions of congressional speeches and basically found two different ways politicians talk. On one side, you've got evidence-based speech. This is the language of facts, data, proof. And on the other side, you have intuition-based speech, which uses words like believe, feel, and guess. Now, here's where it gets wild. When the researchers mapped this out over 145 years, they found something stunning. You see that peak in the mid-70s? That's when political speech was the most evidence-based it had ever been. And ever since then, it's been a nosedive. The Bush/Quayle years weren't the start. They were just a point on that downward slope. And by 2022, that kind of language hit its lowest point ever. Okay, so who cares, right? Politicians talk differently. What's the big deal? Well, it turns out it is a very, very big deal. That same study found that this change in language is directly connected to some of the biggest problems we face as a country. And the stakes are incredibly high. Think about it like this. As the evidence talk went down, two things went way up: political division and the gap between the rich and poor. And at the same time, the ability for Congress to actually get stuff done, well, that went down.
The way people talk has very real consequences.
And just look at this number, negative 0.948. Now, if you're not a statistician, let me just tell you, that is an insanely strong connection. The study found that when fact-based language dropped in Congress, you could actually predict that income inequality would rise 2 years later. It's like when you stop arguing about shared facts, it becomes almost impossible to solve complex economic issues.
So, what does this all mean when you put it together? It means that this shift from evidence to intuition, from facts to feelings, isn't just about words. It has fundamentally rewired our political landscape and the government's ability to even function.
Let's just spell it out. When you have less evidence-based talk, what do you get? You get more division, you get more inequality, you get fewer laws passed. The whole system just gets stuck. When you lose that common ground built on facts, all you're left with is partisan gridlock. Which brings us full circle, right back to our odd couple, George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle. They weren't just two guys in the White House. They were like living, breathing examples of these two completely different ways of doing politics, somehow in the very same administration. On one hand, you had Bush's whole idea, this new world order. It was all about solving massive global problems using evidence, using diplomacy, using a shared understanding of reality. It was outward-looking. It was fact-based. And then, on the other hand, you had the whole reason Quayle was on the ticket in the first place. As the New York Times put it at the time, his job was to polarize the election, to turn it into an us versus them battle. It was a culture war, and in a culture war, facts don't matter nearly as much as feelings and beliefs. And that's really the question for all of us today, isn't it? The Bush administration showed us two different paths. So as we look around at our own complex world, which path are we on? Is our political conversation being defined by the statesman's appeal to evidence or by the performer's appeal to intuition?